At the far end of Fort Grayson's training field, a woman in a torn gray t-shirt and faded camouflage pants stood under the pale morning sky. Dust drifted around her boots as the laughter of young recruits cut across the field like shrapnel. One of them, a broad-shouldered sergeant, grabbed her sleeve and yanked, fabric ripping loud and raw. The sound drew cheers from the watching cadets. She didn't fight back. She didn't even flinch. Her eyes, the color of spent brass, stayed fixed on something behind them. Beyond the mockers, 10 armored vehicles idled in formation, diesel engines rumbling in low rhythm. No one noticed that every turret was already facing the same direction toward her. "Nice uniform," the sergeant barked. "Did the laundry crew lose a bet?" More laughter. Phones came out. Someone muttered, "This one's going viral." She bent down slowly, picked up the torn edge of her sleeve, and brushed away a smear of mud. The motion was calm, almost ritualistic, like she'd done this 1,000 times before. Her name patch simply read Mara T. Nothing else. Most on base assumed she was temporary, some logistics, helper, or mechanic, sent by the civilian contractors. No one asked why she carried herself with the posture of someone used to giving orders, not taking them. A sharp gust swept across the field, stirring the smell of oil and iron. The sergeant stepped closer, chest puffed. "You think wearing camo makes you one of us?" he sneered. She looked up then, not angry, not afraid, just measured. Her voice was level, almost gentle. "Permission to speak freely, Sergeant?" He blinked, thrown off by the formality. "What?" "You might want to stop pulling that thread," she said quietly. "Some things are connected to more than fabric." He laughed, but behind them the air changed. The steady hum of engines deepened, then stopped one by one, in perfect sequence. Silence spread across the base like a command. Dust hung motionless in the still air. Every head turned toward the convoy of armored trucks now sitting perfectly still, their headlights blinking in unison. The sergeant released her sleeve. "What the hell?" She stepped back, adjusting the strap of her torn shirt. Beneath the fabric, a patch glimmered faintly black and gold, the kind only a few officers in the entire military were cleared to even see. A voice cracked through the radio tower speakers. "Authentication complete. Alpha Zero recognized. Awaiting orders." Every recruit froze. The sergeant's face went pale. Mara didn't move. Her voice came out low, steady, carrying across the field without effort. "Engines stand by." The convoy lights flared once, acknowledging, and in that suspended silence, the laughter that had filled the morning vanished, replaced by something colder respect wrapped in fear. No one at Fort Grayson ever mocked the woman in camo again. The dust had not yet settled when the commander of the field unit arrived, his boots striking the ground in sharp measured steps that echoed against the steel hulls of the armored trucks. The recruits who had been laughing minutes earlier straightened instinctively, uncertain whether to stand at attention or pretend nothing unusual had happened. Major Reynolds, tall and angular, radiated the impatience of a man used to instant obedience. His gaze swept over the field until it landed on Mara, the woman still standing calmly beside the silent convoy, her torn sleeve fluttering against her arm like a white flag that refused to fall. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice tight, as if he was speaking to a malfunctioning weapon rather than a person. She didn't answer. The engines remained silent behind her, each machine perfectly aligned, exhaust vents steaming faintly in the cool morning air. Reynolds gestured toward the control bunker. "Get those systems back online," he barked at the technicians. None of them moved. Their screens displayed a single line of text pulsing in red. "Command locked awaiting Alpha. Zero protocol." Mara lowered her eyes for a moment, almost respectfully, then spoke with quiet precision. "Major, the convoy is secure. There's no malfunction." Her tone was polite but final, the kind of voice that carried authority even when it whispered. The major frowned, confusion spreading across his face. "Who gave you the authority to override base operations?" She turned slightly, enough for the sunlight to strike the patch on her shoulder. The gold insignia reflected like a blade. "The system did," she said simply. Around them, a low murmur rippled through the ranks. Some of the older soldiers recognized that symbol, the black falcon encircled by a ring of lightning bolts, and whispered the name they had not heard in years. Echo Division. A unit so classified that even its disbandment had been erased from public records. The younger recruits looked from one face to another, trying to read the fear in their superiors' eyes. Major Reynolds took a step back, the anger in his posture thinning into disbelief. "That unit was decommissioned over a decade ago," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Mara met his gaze evenly. "That's what they wanted you to believe." She tapped her wrist once, and the encrypted tag embedded beneath her skin flashed green. The nearest vehicle hummed to life, not with the roar of ignition, but with a steady vibration that resonated through the ground like a heartbeat. One after another, the convoy lights flickered back on, forming a perfect row of blue indicators waiting for her command. No one breathed. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. The sergeant who had torn her shirt stood rigid beside his comrades, every muscle locked. The memory of his laughter felt obscene in the hush that had replaced it. Mara glanced at him once, not in anger, but as if acknowledging a student who had failed a lesson he never understood. "When systems stop responding," she said, her tone still calm, "it usually means they're waiting for the right frequency." Her eyes lifted toward the silent command tower, where the signal lights were beginning to blink in rhythmic sequence, her sequence. Major Reynolds swallowed hard. "You expect me to believe this is a coincidence?" She tilted her head slightly. "Belief isn't required, Major. Compliance is." The words weren't loud, yet they carried across the field with the precision of an order. Something about her composure unsettled everyone, the way she spoke without raising her voice, the way every mechanical system seemed to breathe in time with her. A moment later, a sharp tone cut through the air from the control tower loudspeakers. The automated voice was metallic, detached, and unmistakably official. Authorization confirmed. "Command relay, transferring to Colonel Mara Thorne, Echo Division Commanding Officer." The declaration hung in the silence like thunder that refused to fade. Every soldier on the field turned toward her at once, disbelief etched across their faces. Reynolds's jaw tightened as protocol took over instinct. He straightened, saluted, and forced the words out through clenched teeth. "Welcome back to command, Colonel." The phrase echoed down the line as others followed suit, hundreds of hands snapping to foreheads in one synchronized motion. The field transformed in an instant from chaos to ceremony, the kind that left no space for mockery. Mara's expression didn't change. She returned the salute with quiet precision, then walked past Reynolds without another word, her boots tracing the faint impressions of order across the sand. The convoy engine started again, not as a roar, but as a slow, steady awakening. The synchronized hum rolled outward, low and powerful, shaking the dust from the air. It sounded like an army remembering its purpose. She stopped beside the lead vehicle, resting her palm on the cold armor plate. Her reflection stared back at her in the polished metal. Tired eyes, gray dust in her hair, the faint outline of the classified insignia glowing beneath the torn fabric. "Stand ready," she said softly. The onboard AI responded immediately with a tone of acknowledgement. Behind her, the recruits who had mocked her now stood silent, their eyes wide with the realization that they had witnessed something forbidden. The convoy's sensors whirred, scanning the field as if assessing each face for loyalty. She didn't look back at them. Instead, she lifted her gaze toward the horizon where the morning sun burned through the haze. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and silence. Then Mara exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders. "Order restored," she murmured. The words were not meant for them, but the field seemed to hear. Every engine shifted to idle at once. Every light turned green. Every soldier knew whatever she had once commanded. It was still alive, still loyal, still waiting. The laughter that had filled the morning was gone, replaced by the measured rhythm of engines awaiting her next command. And in that vast, disciplined quiet, the woman they had mocked was no longer just a figure in camo. She was the signal every machine, every soldier, and every ghost of Echo Division had been waiting to hear. Major Reynolds remained motionless as Mara passed him, the convoy's synchronized engines humming like a living organism reawakening after a decade of silence. Every soldier on the field watched her cross the sand toward the command tower, their salutes still frozen mid-air, unsure if the gesture was protocol or prayer. The hum deepened, a layered vibration rising through the ground, as if the earth itself recognized her command frequency. In the distance, the horizon trembled with the heat of a new day, the kind of light that made everything look sharp, precise, unforgiving. Inside the tower, dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that cut through the narrow windows. The air smelled of metal, heat, and anticipation. Mara stepped onto the graded floor, her boots striking each step in perfect cadence. Technicians stood aside without orders, their eyes darting between her and the glowing screens that displayed lines of code they no longer understood. She approached the central console, a relic from a defunct era, and placed her hand on the biometric reader. The glass plate glowed faintly beneath her fingertips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen erupted with cascading green symbols. A line of text appeared. Command restoration acknowledged. Echo division active. The sound that followed was not loud, yet it felt enormous. Every display across the control room flickered to life, each one aligning to a single encrypted frequency. Satellite channels, field cameras, and old classified archives began synchronizing under a forgotten clearance code. The technicians stared, pale and silent, while Mara watched the data converge with the expression of someone watching a long-lost friend breathe again. All systems reconnected, a calm synthetic voice announced, one that hadn't been heard since the division's disappearance. Reynolds entered behind her, the sharp edges of his anger dulled into uneasy respect. "Colonel Thorne," he began, his tone uncertain, "Echo Division was erased from the registry. How are you even still active?" She didn't turn. "Erased," she repeated softly, "is just another word for hidden." Her gaze stayed fixed on the glowing map that now filled the main screen, a topographic grid marked with coordinates deep within the Nevada desert. "They buried our unit because they feared what we built," she continued, her voice low but firm. "An integrated combat network that could think faster than any command chain." The Major's brow furrowed. "You mean the automated fleet project?" Mara nodded once. "We called it the Sentinel Loop. It wasn't just machines, it was loyalty encoded into steel." She reached toward the console, fingers gliding over the interface as the convoy outside responded with subtle movements, turrets aligning, engines adjusting in silent precision. The synchronization was unnerving. "These vehicles aren't following you," Reynolds said, half accusing. "They're worshipping you." Her reply was calm. "They're responding to programming discipline, not devotion." An alert flashed red on the nearest monitor. Unauthorized transmission detected. Source: External Command Channel. A voice crackled through the comm line, coarse and mechanical. "Unidentified activity detected at Fort Grayson. Prepare for lockdown. Neutralize echo identifiers." The technicians froze. Mara's expression hardened. The room's temperature seemed to drop. "They found us faster than I expected," she said quietly. She pressed a button on the panel, and every external communication port sealed itself with a metallic click. "Major, get your people clear of the convoy perimeter." Reynolds hesitated, reading something in her eyes, a mixture of duty and exhaustion. "You're expecting an attack?" She shook her head. "Not expecting. Confirming." The map zoomed in automatically, revealing a cluster of red signatures approaching from the south. Drones, armored units, command vehicles moving fast. The official military wanted their ghost back under control. "You said Echo Division was hidden," Reynolds whispered. "Hidden things have a way of being hunted," she replied. Outside, the sky shimmered with the shimmer of heat and motion. The recruits who had mocked her minutes earlier now scrambled behind cover, eyes wide as a low drone of engines filled the air. Mara stepped out of the tower, the sunlight cutting a pale halo around her as she faced the convoy. The air vibrated with potential energy. She lifted her hand, palm outward, and every vehicle responded as if pulled by invisible strings, hatches sealed, sensors rotated, turrets aligned toward the horizon. A deep rumble rolled through the desert as the first line of approaching vehicles appeared beyond the ridge, dust trailing like smoke. Reynolds shouted into his radio, trying to raise command, but the signal was already scrambled. "Colonel, they're going to breach the field." Mara's voice carried calm authority. "Not if we remind them who built the field." She issued a short, precise order. "Protocol Shield, 9, defensive perimeter." The convoy engines surged to full power. The machines moved as one organism. Steel treads bit into the dirt, forming a crescent-shaped defense line around the base. Energy from decades of dormant technology pulsed through their armor plates, sending a visible shimmer across the surface like heat lightning. Mara stood at the center of the formation, her torn sleeves snapping against the wind. For the first time, the recruits saw what command truly looked like. Not loud, not proud, but absolute. The incoming vehicles slowed, uncertain. The lead unit transmitted a final warning. "Fort Grayson, stand down or we open fire." Mara answered by lifting her wrist device to her lips. "You first," she said softly. The words barely carried, but the system heard. The convoy released a coordinated burst, a wave of electromagnetic pulse that rolled across the desert like a silent storm. The advancing formation shuddered, engines sputtering to a dead halt, radios dropping into static. When the silence returned, it was total. The recruits peeked from behind cover, stunned by the precision of what they had just witnessed. Reynolds stared at her, no longer questioning authority, only awe. Mara lowered her arms slowly, breathing steady. "Stand down," she ordered again, and every machine obeyed. The air settled back into stillness, the kind that only comes after obedience is restored. Dust drifted lazily in the morning light, coating everything in a faint golden haze. She turned to the stunned soldiers, her expression unreadable but her voice clear. "Echo Division is not a story. It's a reminder," she said, eyes sweeping the field. "Systems built on honor don't forget their commands, even when people do." For a long moment no one spoke. The recruits lowered their weapons, heads bowed slightly, not from fear but from understanding. Major Reynolds approached her slowly, still trying to find his voice. "What happens now, Colonel?" She looked past him toward the horizon, where the disabled enemy convoy sat motionless under the rising Sunday. "Now," she said almost to herself, "we teach them the difference between erasing a name and ending a legacy." The engines behind her idled in perfect rhythm, waiting. The day had grown quiet again, the kind of quiet that belongs only to those who have seen power return to its rightful hands. And in that silence, the legend of Echo Division breathed again, carried by a woman in torn camo who needed no title, no permission, and no applause, only the sound of every engine waiting for her next order. The desert sun had climbed high above Fort Grayson, burning away the morning haze until every metal surface gleamed like glass under fire. The disabled enemy convoy remained scattered along the ridge, silent and lifeless, a graveyard of arrogance shimmering in the heat. Within the perimeter, Mara stood at the center of her machines, a single figure framed by the rhythmic idle of 10 armored vehicles that still waited for her command. The soldiers who had mocked her earlier now moved with quiet precision, following unspoken orders, their gestures careful as if afraid to disturb the balance that had descended upon the field. Major Reynolds approached slowly, his uniform streaked with dust and disbelief. "Colonel, command wants an update," he said, holding out a radio whose signal light blinked nervously. She looked at it for a long moment before taking it from his hand, the device dwarfed by the silence around them. "This is Thorne," she said, her tone measured, controlled. The radio crackled with static. Then a voice heavy with bureaucracy broke through, questioning authorization, demanding explanation, refusing to recognize what had already happened. Mara listened without expression, her eyes scanning the crippled machines across the valley. When the voice paused for confirmation, she answered quietly. "Authorization already confirmed, sir. Echo Division operational, Fort Grayson secure." The reply never came. Only static filled the air. Somewhere deep within the system, higher authorities were realizing that a forgotten program had awakened and reclaimed control of its own destiny. She lowered the radio, letting it hang at her side. "Major," she said evenly, "prepare the men for evacuation of civilians from the southern checkpoint. If command chooses to deny what happened here, we won't wait for their permission to act." Reynolds hesitated, studying her profile against the glare of sunlight. "And you?" he asked quietly. "What will you do?" She turned toward the convoy, the edges of her torn sleeve brushing the patch on her shoulder. "What I was built to do," she said. "Protect. Have." The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of fuel and sand. From the distant ridge came the creak of cooling metal as the disabled vehicles settled into stillness. Mara walked toward them alone, her steps deliberate, each one leaving a small print in the powdery soil. The silence of the battlefield was total, except for the whisper of her boots. When she reached the first enemy truck, she rested her palm on the scorched armor, feeling the residual warmth of defeat. Her voice was low but clear, meant for the machines more than the men watching behind her. "Deactivate threat protocol," she said. Recovery mode engaged. As if obeying an unseen chain of command, the disabled convoy lights flickered once, then faded to standby blue. Even in surrender, the technology respected hierarchy. Back at the base, the younger recruits began to speak again, their voices hushed, carrying the awe that follows revelation. One of them whispered, "She didn't fight them, she commanded them." Another answered, "She was Echo Division. The system didn't forget her." Reynolds heard them but said nothing. Some lessons didn't need correction. He turned to watch Mara return from the ridge, dust rising behind her like smoke from extinguished fire. For a fleeting second, he saw her not as a legend or a threat, but as a soldier who had simply refused to rust. When she reached the hangar, the technicians had already cleared space around the central control module. The once dark monitors now displayed the insignia of Echo Division, the black falcon outlined in gold, wings spread wide across the screen. She placed her hand on the console, and the logo pulsed as if alive. "System status," she said. A synthetic voice responded, "All units functional. External interference neutralized. Awaiting next directive." She exhaled, the sound almost like relief. "Then stand down," she ordered softly. The engines quieted, the rhythmic vibration fading into the still air. It was over for now. Outside, the soldiers gathered in small clusters, talking in low tones, trying to make sense of what they had seen. Some still looked at her with reverence, others with unease, but none with mockery. The legend had already begun to reshape itself in their memories. They would tell stories of the woman in camo who stopped an army with nothing but a voice and a forgotten code. They would exaggerate details, blur names, but the essence would remain: a commander who never needed rank to command respect. Mara stepped onto the observation deck overlooking the base. The sun was beginning to slide west, tinting the sky in streaks of gold and iron. Below her, the shadow of the convoy stretched long across the sand, a reminder that power, once awakened, casts its own shape. She stood there silently for several minutes, listening to the faint murmur of the wind brushing against steel, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe without calculating the next order. Reynolds joined her, his voice softened by exhaustion. "What happens to Echo Division now?" he asked. She kept her eyes on the horizon. "Echo was never a division," she said slowly. "It was a promised discipline without arrogance, loyalty without witnesses. We disappear when the work is done." He nodded, understanding more than her words allowed. "Then, what happens to you?" She gave a small, tired smile. "I disappear with it." A long pause settled between them before the base alarm broke the quiet, signaling the arrival of an official transport. Dust clouds rose near the road as command vehicles approached. Mara turned toward the sound, then back to Reynolds. "They'll want statements, reports, explanations," she said. "Give them yours, leave mine blank." Without waiting for a reply, she descended the stairs, her silhouette cutting through the haze like a figure moving back into myth. By the time the officials reached the main yard, she was gone. The convoy sat in perfect formation, engines cool, systems dormant. On the control panel of the lead vehicle, a single message pulsed faintly on the dark screen. "Once a soldier, always a protector." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that swallowed the field. In that fading light, Fort Grayson looked less like a base and more like a monument, a place where machines remembered honor, and one forgotten woman reminded them what command truly meant. The wind carried her name through the silence, not shouted, not sung, but whispered with the kind of reverence reserved for legends. And as night fell across the desert, every dormant engine seemed to echo that truth in the stillness. A low, steady hum that promised the legacy of Echo Division and of Colonel Mara Thorne would never truly sleep again. Night came quietly to Fort Grayson, the kind of night that made the desert look endless and the sky feel heavier than stone. The day's heat bled from the sand, leaving the air cool, sharp, and laced with the faint tang of burnt diesel. Floodlights cast long beams across the yard, carving shadows from the motionless convoy that now slept in perfect alignment, each machine gleaming under a veil of moonlight. The soldiers had finished their reports hours ago, their voices hushed, their eyes wary, as if afraid to wake whatever ghost had taken residence among them. Inside the hangar, the silence was thicker. The command consoles still glowed dimly with the insignia of Echo Division gold against black, like a heartbeat drawn in light. Major Reynolds stood near the doorway, arms folded, watching the faint rhythm on the screens. The base had returned to routine on paper, but no one truly believed that normalcy had returned. The woman in camo had vanished at dusk, leaving behind only a signature code embedded in every operational log. Protocol, Thorne. No one dared delete it. Reynolds rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling deep behind his eyes. The official investigators from Central Command had arrived earlier, sharp suits and clipped tones, their questions rehearsed and hollow. They asked about chain of command, about weapons discharge, about what had triggered the electromagnetic surge. They did not ask about the silence that had followed, the kind of silence that carried respect. Every answer he gave was technically correct, but every truth he left unsaid grew heavier. When the questioning ended, one of them had muttered that Colonel Thorne was to be classified as missing in action, as if bureaucracy could bury a living legend under paperwork. He looked again toward the convoy outside. The desert wind hissed softly through the steel frames, creating a sound that almost resembled breathing. Somewhere among those machines was the trace of her presence, a sequence of code, a hidden rhythm, the echo of a command that no one else could issue. Reynolds exhaled slowly and turned to leave, but as he reached for the lights, a faint pulse flickered across the primary monitor. Lines of text began scrolling upward, each one tagged with her encrypted ID. System integrity nominal. External threats contained. Awaiting redeployment authorization. For a moment he simply stared, unsure if he was witnessing a malfunction or a message meant only for him. Outside, the desert shimmered beneath the moon. A single figure moved along the perimeter fence, her shadow long and deliberate. The torn sleeve had been replaced with a field jacket, the patch now fully visible black falcon, gold ring, faint scarring along its edges from years of use. Mara Thorne walked without haste, each step careful, measured, as though she were walking between two worlds, one of men and one of machines. She paused beside the first armored truck, resting her palm against the cold metal. The vehicle responded with a low electrical hum, not loud enough to be heard from the barracks, but enough to make the dust shift around her boots. She whispered something too soft for words, and the lights along the convoy blinked once, acknowledging. These were not weapons anymore. They were witnesses. They had seen arrogance, obedience, fear, and faith, all under the same Sunday. For a brief instant, Mara closed her eyes. The years of silence, the exile, the hidden orders that had sent her into the desert, all of it coalesced into this single moment of stillness. Mission complete, she murmured. Yet even as she said it, she knew the work of soldiers was never truly finished. From the ridge behind her, a low rumble carried across the sand. A new transport column approached, headlights distant but steady official reinforcements, maybe, or another attempt to reclaim what couldn't be contained. Mara didn't move. The wind caught the edge of her jacket and lifted it slightly, revealing the faint outline of an older scar running across her arm. The past had a way of resurfacing, even when the present tried to bury it. Back in the control tower, Reynolds watched the convoy through the reinforced glass. The radar showed the approaching units, but the comm channels remained silent. He felt a strange calm settle in his chest. "She's still out there," he whispered to himself, though no one else was there to hear. The console beeped once, displaying a single incoming transmission. He hesitated before accepting. The screen filled with a short text command, unsigned but unmistakable. "Maintain readiness. Echo does not retire." He smiled despite himself. "Copy that, Colonel," he said quietly. His reflection in the glass looked older, smaller but steadier somehow. Outside, the first gusts of wind swept through the yard, kicking up fine grains of sand that sparkled briefly under the floodlights. The vehicles remained still, but their onboard sensors pulsed with quiet light, one after another, forming a line of soft illumination stretching into the darkness. Mara reached the final vehicle at the edge of the compound, where the chain-link fence met the open desert. Beyond that fence lay miles of empty land, a horizon without borders. She looked back once at the base, at the rows of soldiers who would wake tomorrow pretending the world hadn't shifted, and then turned toward the wasteland. Her voice was barely more than breath. "Once a soldier," she said, "always a protector." The words drifted into the night like a code released into open air, carried across miles of desert and static, until even the stars seemed to pulse in time with it. Behind her, one by one, the engines of the convoy roared to life, not loud, not hostile, but steady, loyal, eternal. The machines formed a line at the fence, their headlights illuminating her path forward, the beams stretching deep into the dark horizon as though guiding her home. By the time the first rays of dawn brushed the desert, both she and the convoy were gone, leaving behind only tire tracks pressed deep into the sand. The base awoke to a strange peace, the kind that follows revelation. In the command tower, Reynolds found the final line left glowing on the console, its golden text fading with the sunrise. Echo Division, stand by. Mission unending. He read it once, then again, before shutting down the monitor. Outside, the desert wind began to erase the tire tracks, folding them back into the endless dunes. But the hum of distant engines lingered somewhere beyond hearing steady, disciplined, alive. And in that quiet stretch of morning, Fort Grayson became more than a base. It became a reminder. Courage, honor, and compassion do not fade with rank or time. They move forward, silent as machinery, eternal as the desert itself, carried by the echo of a woman in camo who never needed permission to command the dawn. Morning arrived quietly over Fort Grayson, the horizon bruised with streaks of copper and rose, the air holding that brief stillness before the desert decided to burn again. The soldiers who remained on base moved with a subdued calm, their footsteps measured, their conversations hushed, as though afraid to disturb the echo of what had happened the night before. The convoy bay stood empty now, nothing but tracks, carved deep into the sand and faint imprints of treads that led straight toward the southern horizon where light met dust. Yet even without the machines, the place felt charged, as if some part of their presence still hummed beneath the earth, waiting for her return. Major Reynolds stood at the perimeter fence, his uniform crisp again, but his eyes carrying the sleepless weight of responsibility. The official recovery teams had left before dawn, their vehicles heavy with forms and evidence, their voices clipped and sterile, determined to frame the event as a communications malfunction. None of them looked at the field for too long. They didn't want to admit they'd seen engines obey a human heartbeat. Reynolds had let them leave without argument. Some truths could not survive in reports. Now he stood alone with the wind tugging at his sleeves. Watching the far line of sand blur into the rising Sunday, he had expected relief when it was over, but instead there was only quiet admiration and something close to loss. The faint buzz of a radio broke the stillness. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the battered field transceiver she had used. The signal light flickered, weak but steady. Static crackled, then a voice came through, low and calm, stripped of rank but full of certainty. "Fort Grayson secure?" she asked. He smiled despite himself, recognizing the unshakable cadence of Colonel Mara Thorne. "Affirmative," he replied softly. "Convoy status?" There was a pause, long enough to make him wonder if the connection had died. Then her voice returned, quieter. "Mobile. Heading south to Archive Site Echo 1. The loop's still functional, it remembers." Then silence again, the kind that carried finality and promise in equal measure. He turned off the radio and slipped it back into his pocket, staring out across the dunes where the tire tracks dissolved into heat haze. Around him, Fort Grayson was beginning to wake, a base returning to its rhythm. Morning drills, breakfast call, the clang of maintenance doors. Life went on, but every sound seemed different now, touched by the echo of discipline she had left behind. He walked toward the mess hall, passing rows of recruits, standing at formation, their eyes following him in uneasy reverence. They no longer joked about the woman in camo. Her name had become an unspoken rule, something uttered only with quiet respect. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and metal trays. A young corporal approached with a clipboard, hesitant but earnest. "Sir, the new trainees are asking if Echo Division is real," he said. Reynolds took the clipboard, scanning the attendance marks, then looked up. "Echo Division isn't a unit," he said finally. "It's a standard." The corporal frowned, unsure what that meant, but he nodded and walked away. Reynolds sat down with his coffee, the steam curling upward like the ghosts of unspoken thoughts. The words she'd left behind repeated in his mind. Once a soldier, always a protector. Outside, the wind picked up again, sweeping across the field with a whispering rush that sounded eerily like a convoy passing in the distance. Some of the soldiers turned their heads instinctively toward the sound, eyes narrowing, but there was nothing to see except the wavering heat rising from the sand. Still, the sound lingered, a low, rhythmic hum, steady as breath. Reynolds listened for a long time, letting it settle somewhere deep within him, until the difference between memory and machinery blurred. Later that afternoon, he found himself back in the hangar, unable to stay away. The control room was dark, except for a single monitor still active at the far end. He crossed the floor slowly, boots echoing against the concrete, and touched the power switch, but the screen refused to turn off. Across the black background, golden letters began to appear, one line at a time. Echo Division, Directive 2, preserve the balance. Beneath it, a timestamp marked just minutes earlier, proof that someone or something still held control of the network. His pulse quickened, not from fear but from awe. She was still connected. He looked up toward the ceiling, listening again, half expecting to hear her voice threaded through the hum of electricity. Instead, another sound emerged, the faint rumble of engines far beyond the base, distant but distinct. It rolled across the desert like thunder that refused to fade. The men outside began to gather, pointing toward the southern horizon. A line of dust had begun to rise again, glimmering in the harsh afternoon Sunday. It was too even to be wind, too deliberate to be chance. Reynolds stepped outside, the glare stabbing into his eyes. The convoy was returning, not all of it, just one vehicle, the lead command truck, its armor dull with travel dust. As it approached the gate, the guards instinctively saluted, though no driver was visible through the tinted glass. The vehicle slowed, stopped, and with a mechanical sigh, its rear compartment opened. Inside was nothing but a small metal case resting on the floor. Reynolds moved closer, heart steady but hands trembling. He lifted the case out and placed it on the ground. The latch clicked open easily. Inside lay a single item, Mara Thorne's old identification tag, burnished smooth from years of wear, engraved with her name and a final message beneath it. Echo continues where silence begins. M. He closed the case slowly, the desert wind swirling around him, tugging at his collar, as though to remind him that the story was not finished, only paused. Behind him, the soldiers watched in reverent quiet, unsure what they were witnessing but understanding instinctively that something sacred had passed through their hands. Reynolds looked toward the horizon again, where the light shimmered gold and unforgiving. "Godspeed, Colonel," he said under his breath, and the wind carried the words away. As evening returned, the base lights flickered on one by one, spreading a soft glow across the compound. The men resumed their routines, drills, maintenance, laughter life reclaiming its rhythm. But beneath the noise, the faint hum of engines could still be felt, vibrating through the ground like a pulse. Somewhere beyond the dunes, beyond the reach of command and paperwork, the convoy moved under her direction, unseen but unforgotten, guarding the empty places where silence was most fragile. And as night fell once more over Fort Grayson, that hum became a kind of prayer, a promise that courage, honor, and compassion would not fade with rank or time, only change form, carried forward by the echo of a woman who had once been mocked, and who had answered mockery with command. The following dawn stretched pale and weightless across the desert, turning the sky into a sheet of silver before the heat began to rise again. The base was already awake, though the usual clatter of boots and machinery seemed muted, softened by something like reverence. Soldiers moved through their routines with a new precision, not because anyone ordered them to, but because the air itself demanded respect. Every command sounded quieter, every salute sharper, as though the memory of the woman in camo lingered in every movement they made. Major Reynolds stood on the observation deck overlooking the training field, his coffee cooling in his hand, the bitter smell cutting through the morning dust. The convoy tracks were almost gone now, smoothed away by wind overnight, yet the direction they pointed southwest, toward the barren stretches of Nevada, still carved an invisible line through the landscape. He followed that line with his eyes, wondering where she was, wondering if the hum he still swore he heard at night was just wind or something alive beneath the sand. When the reports began to arrive from other installations, he wasn't surprised. The encrypted files carried strange anomalies, unidentified pings across abandoned relay networks, encrypted bursts marked echo active, drone footage showing heat signatures where no personnel were registered. One even showed the faint outline of a moving convoy, lights dim, formation perfect, vanishing before the satellite could adjust focus. The analysts called it a glitch. The engineers blamed ghosts in the code. But Reynolds knew better discipline leaves fingerprints, even when the hand is gone. He forwarded the data to command, but included no commentary. He knew how it would be received. Buried in bureaucratic indifference. Redacted by men who feared what they couldn't classify. After sending the last transmission, he closed the terminal and stepped outside, letting the desert air sting his face. In the far distance, a column of dust twisted up like smoke from a fire that had already burned itself out. The sight made him think of her again, not as a commander, not even as a myth, but as a constant. Some people left footprints. Mara Thorne had left a system that refused to die. Later that morning, during a routine inspection, a technician called him to the control bay. The young man's face was pale, eyes wide with the disbelief of someone witnessing something sacred. "Sir," he whispered, pointing at the main console. On the monitor, the insignia of Echo Division pulsed faintly, the Falcon's wings slowly spreading as if waking from sleep. Underneath, new text appeared. Protocol Sentinel Observation Phase initiated. Reynolds stared at the words, a chill crawling up his spine. "Is it online?" he asked. The technician nodded. No input, no signal, it just activated. Reynolds leaned closer, studying the shifting code. Every few seconds, coordinates flashed briefly, marking remote desert zones hundreds of miles apart. Recon stations, forgotten airstrips, abandoned supply depots, all suddenly alive again, linked through a network no one had touched in years. He recognized the pattern. A defense loop designed to monitor and protect without central command. She had done it. Echo Division wasn't returning. It had never left. It had simply learned to exist without orders. He dismissed the technician, telling him it was classified maintenance work, and waited until the hangar emptied. Alone, he reached for the terminal and keyed in a single line. "Query Colonel Thorne." The response came instantly, a line of calm text glowing against the dark screen. "Active. Status. Field command. Transmission restricted." Reynolds exhaled, part relief, part awe. "She's still moving," he murmured. The console flickered once more, then displayed a final message before going dark. "Protection ongoing. Fort Grayson secure." That night, the base lights glowed softer, almost like lanterns instead of flood lamps. The desert beyond the fence shimmered faintly under the moon, a pale reflection of silver and silence. Some of the younger recruits gathered near the fire barrels, whispering the new rumors about how she had merged with the system, about how Echo Division was no longer a unit of soldiers, but a living network bound to her will. They said if you stood near the southern wall and listened carefully, you could still hear the engines humming, like a heartbeat beneath the sand. Reynolds didn't discourage the stories. Legends kept soldiers honest. Instead, he returned to the observation deck again, the same spot where he had stood each morning since her disappearance. The sky was clear, the stars like cold metal dust. Somewhere in that emptiness, her convoy was still moving, silent and unseen, patrolling a border no one else remembered. He thought of the words engraved on the tag she'd left behind. "Echo continues where silence begins." The line felt less like poetry and more like an operating instruction. He stayed there until the horizon began to brighten again, until the edges of the world turned from black to bronze. The first call for morning drills echoed faintly below, steady and disciplined. The base was alive, not in fear or pride, but in purpose. She had left that behind, a template for order, a rhythm for the living. He realized then that she hadn't vanished. She had simply dispersed, spread through every system, every heartbeat, every soldier who had witnessed her command. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a flicker of light far off in the desert, like a single flare winking against the dawn. It pulsed, once, twice, then faded. He didn't need confirmation. He knew it was her, or the convoy, or whatever the two had become. He raised his hand instinctively, half salute, half farewell. "Carry on, Colonel," he whispered. The wind lifted a veil of dust across the fence line, erasing the last of the tire tracks. But beneath the ground, faint vibrations lingered, too steady to be wind, too deliberate to be chance. Somewhere beyond sight, engines were turning again, guided by a code older than fear and stronger than time. And in that quiet rhythm, Fort Grayson found its peace, not in forgetting the woman who had once commanded silence, but in learning to live by the echo she left behind. When the sun finally cleared the horizon, the convoy's shadow was nowhere to be seen. Yet every gleam of metal, every hum of machinery, every heartbeat of discipline across the base carried her signature. It was as if the world itself had memorized her voice and chose never to let it fade. The sun had burned across the desert for 3 days before Fort Grayson began to breathe normally again, its rhythms settling into a fragile imitation of order. Yet under the quiet surface, the air carried something dense and electric, like the pause before a storm that refused to announce itself. The soldiers moved through their drills with renewed precision, but their eyes were different now, wider, searching, as if they had glimpsed something vast and could not unsee it. The memory of her still lived inside the cadence of their commands, the pauses between their salutes, the instinctive silence that followed the word honor. Major Reynolds had learned to stop explaining what had happened. Command had filed their reports, redacted their own fears, and closed the matter under classified operations, contained. Yet every night the sky above the base shimmered faintly with static, the kind that belonged not to weather but to communication, thin, coded bursts that flared and vanished like invisible lightning. The technicians called it interference. Reynolds called it presence. He had stopped trying to fix it the day he realized the pattern matched her heartbeat from Echo Division's old biometric logs. That morning, he walked along the perimeter fence again, the sand crunching softly beneath his boots, the horizon stretching flat and endless. Somewhere beyond the line of visibility, the world remained in motion, convoys moving without orders, satellites aligning without command, and one voice still guiding them all. He carried her dog tag in his breast pocket now, the metal warm from the sun, the engraving slowly fading under his thumb. Every time he touched it, he remembered her final words. Echo continues where silence begins. Inside the operations center, the lights were dimmed to conserve power. The young communications officer, a woman barely 20, sat stiffly at her console, her face illuminated by the glow of encrypted data streams. "Sir," she called softly, her voice unsure, "we're getting another unidentified transmission. Origin unknown." Reynolds moved closer, leaning over her shoulder. On the screen, the signal appeared as a single line of text repeating every few seconds, "Fort Grayson status request." The frequency was old, one that hadn't been active since the classified blackout. "Respond," he said. The officer hesitated. "What should I say?" "Say we're still here." The reply came instantly, sharp and precise. "Acknowledged. Maintain readiness. Sequence 9 in motion." Then the feed cut out. The officer looked at him, wide-eyed. "Was that her?" she whispered. Reynolds didn't answer, but his silence said everything. He stared at the console as if expecting the machine itself to explain. Deep beneath the desert, something mechanical stirred, a faint tremor running through the reinforced floor. It lasted only a few seconds but left the air humming with quiet energy. By afternoon, the tremor had become a rumor. Men in the motor pool swore they felt vibrations through the hulls of idle vehicles. Technicians reported power spikes that traced back to systems supposedly decommissioned years ago. Every unexplained movement, every flicker of light, became part of the same whispered narrative. She was still commanding. The desert had turned into her frequency. That evening, Reynolds gathered his officers in the briefing hall. The room smelled of oil, coffee, and unspoken questions. "Gentlemen," he began, his tone even, "we may be witnessing the reactivation of an autonomous command network. Our job is to maintain discipline, not fear." A young lieutenant raised his hand. "Sir, if she's out there, what's her mission now?" The question hung heavy in the stale air. Reynolds looked at the map projected across the wall, a lattice of routes stretching through the desert, each one pulsing faintly in gold. "Same as it ever was," he said quietly. "Protection." After the meeting, he remained alone in the hall. The lights flickered once, and in the brief shadow, he thought he saw her standing near the doorway, still, calm, eyes unreadable. When the light returned, the space was empty, yet the impression lingered. He smiled faintly, half at himself, half at the idea that the human mind could miss a ghost and still salute it. Outside, the wind had risen, carrying with it the low hum of distant machinery, the familiar heartbeat of engines waiting for her voice. That night, the stars hung low, sharp as shattered glass. The desert stretched endlessly, a mirror of silence and hidden motion. In the control tower, Reynolds sat alone, the glow from the monitors painting his face in cold blue. Another message appeared on the screen, this one different, less a command than a farewell. Phase complete. Fort Grayson remains under your care. Maintain honor. Echo watching. He read it twice before the words faded, replaced by a single symbol, the black falcon outlined in gold. He leaned back in his chair, letting the fatigue melt into the quiet. Somewhere in that stillness, he could almost hear her voice not speaking, but thinking, an unbroken thread running through the circuits and the dust. Maybe she had become what she always was, the embodiment of discipline itself, something no order could contain or erase. Before dawn, he stepped outside one last time. The desert was cold, the wind thin and sharp, the stars beginning to fade behind the first blush of morning. He looked toward the horizon, and for a brief moment, he saw them tiny points of light moving in formation, barely visible against the growing Sunday at 10, maybe 12, gliding low and silent, their silhouettes too precise to be coincidence. They didn't approach the base. They passed beyond it, heading east, the same direction the convoy had taken weeks ago. He raised his hand in salute, the motion slow, deliberate, carried by instinct rather than ceremony. "Safe travels, Colonel," he murmured. The lights flickered once, as if acknowledging, then vanished into the horizon. The desert fell still again, but its silence was full, not empty. It was the silence of completion, of continuity. By the time the first bugle call sounded, Fort Grayson had returned to its ordinary pulse. Engines warmed, flags rose, soldiers marched. Yet each motion carried something intangible, a rhythm set not by clock or commander, but by the echo she left behind. And though her name would never appear in official reports, her presence remained in every hum of machinery, every perfectly timed salute, and every quiet moment before dawn when the base held its breath, listening for the whisper of an unseen convoy passing through the endless horizon. And so the legend of Echo Division endured, not as story or superstition, but as protocol written in silence, a living doctrine of courage, discipline, and compassion that no time could erode. Fort Grayson had not lost its commander. It had inherited her voice, etched into the steel and dust, carried endlessly forward by the engines that still remembered her command. The heat came early that morning, rising from the desert floor in shimmering ribbons that blurred the horizon into liquid gold. Fort Grayson looked half asleep under the weight of the sun, its barracks washed in white glare, its vehicles lined like statues awaiting purpose. Yet beneath the surface calm there was movement, an unseen rhythm that pulsed through circuits and sand, subtle but persistent, like a heartbeat that refused to fade. The hum of buried power cables carried a faint vibration, one that technicians dismissed as thermal distortion, though everyone who had served through the incident knew better. Major Reynolds had grown older in the weeks since Mara Thorne's disappearance, though the calendar insisted it had been only days. The lines around his eyes had deepened, carved by sleepless nights spent watching the sky, listening for frequencies that no longer belonged to any registry. He stood on the edge of the motor yard now, hands clasped behind his back, staring toward the south where the convoy had last been seen. The sand there still held the faintest trace of tread marks, smooth but not erased. He had come to believe that the desert remembered, that even the ground obeyed her still. Inside the control bunker, the hum of machinery continued, soft and deliberate, the sound of a living network inhaling and exhaling through miles of wire. The new communications chief, a quiet woman named Garza, approached with a clipboard pressed to her chest. "Sir, the Night Watch radar picked something up," she said carefully, as if speaking too loud might wake the ghosts that guarded the base. Reynolds followed her to the monitor bank. Across the screens, dots moved in tight formation, each one flickering at identical intervals. "Unidentified vehicles," she explained, "speed consistent with the convoy pattern." He leaned closer, watching the display cycle through coordinates, his pulse steady but deliberate. "Same trajectory?" he asked. "Exactly the same," she said. "They're circling, not advancing." For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the soft whir of the projectors and the distant hiss of wind through the hangar doors. Finally, he said, "They're watching." Garza swallowed. "Should I alert command?" Reynolds shook his head. "Command doesn't need to know. Fort Grayson already belongs to her." The words surprised even him, yet once spoken they felt absolute. He straightened his posture, the gesture of a man reacquainting himself with discipline. "We'll acknowledge the signal and stand ready. That's all." When he stepped outside again, the sun had climbed higher, bright enough to bleach the horizon into nothingness. The air shimmered with invisible motion. Somewhere far beyond the perimeter, the engines of the unseen convoy shifted their tone, not louder but closer, as if moving through layers of heat and memory rather than distance. The soldiers near the gate looked up instinctively. None spoke. A wind rolled through the compound, carrying with it the scent of metal and dust, and for an instant the flags snapped in unison, every thread straining toward the same direction. Later that afternoon, a maintenance crew discovered new tire tracks near the southern checkpoint, broad, deep, unmistakable. They stretched for 20 yards before vanishing into unbroken sand. When asked, the night sentries swore no vehicle had entered or exited. The incident was logged as environmental interference, but the report never reached headquarters. Reynolds signed it himself, adding a single annotation in the margin. Echo reconnaissance. Passive. No threat. That evening, he locked the file in a metal drawer and stood for a long while beside the window, watching the last light drain from the desert. When darkness came, it was complete an ocean of shadow where stars burned white and sharp above the endless dunes. The base lights glowed in orderly rows, pale islands against the void. Reynolds walked the perimeter one last time, boots grinding against the gravel, his breath clouding faintly in the cooling air. Somewhere in the distance, a sound stirred a deep, steady rhythm, like engines turning over far beneath the ground. He paused, closed his eyes, and let it fill him. The sound was not mechanical anymore. It was alive, patient, confident. It spoke without words, a language of timing and loyalty. He returned to the command tower just before midnight. The communications console had activated itself, screen bathing the room in cold light. A single message blinked in the center. Sequence 9 complete. Transfer of guardianship initiated. He typed a reply without hesitation. Fort Grayson, operational. Standing by. The screen pulsed once, then displayed one final line before going dark again. Protection confirmed, courage sustained. For a moment, he simply sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the generators below, realizing the meaning behind the message. Echo Division had not ended, it had multiplied. The system she built was no longer dependent on her presence. It had absorbed her principles, turning obedience into creed. As dawn approached, the first glint of light caught the antenna array on the tower roof, scattering thin beams across the yard. The soldiers emerged from the barracks, shoulders squared, faces calm, their movements perfectly synchronized as if guided by an unseen metronome. They didn't know why their timing matched so perfectly, only that it felt right, as though the base itself whispered the count. Reynolds watched them assemble and thought of her again, not the legend, but the woman who had chosen silence over recognition, purpose over comfort. He realized that command was not about authority but inheritance, and that Fort Grayson had inherited her rhythm forever. As the bugle sounded, the note carried clean and high through the cold air, echoing across the open desert. For a heartbeat, the sound seemed to meet an answering vibration from far away, a faint metallic resonance rolling through the dunes before fading into the wind. Reynolds closed his eyes, letting the two sounds merge into one. It felt like acknowledgement, like the earth itself saluting. When he opened them again, the horizon shimmered with the thin outline of motion, a convoy of light dissolving into morning. He didn't call the watchtower or order a report. He simply watched until the image was gone, then turned back toward the base where his men were already at work, their voices crisp, their steps certain. The hum beneath the ground continued, soft and steady, a promise that the spirit of Echo Division, its discipline, its compassion, its relentless order, still moved through every circuit and every heartbeat. Fort Grayson no longer waited for the woman in camo to return. It carried her forward, line by line, breath by breath, into a future built on the silence she left behind. The following weeks unfolded beneath a relentless stretch of heat, the kind that made the desert shimmer like a sea of molten glass. Fort Grayson adjusted to it with the calm precision of an old soldier, its routines sharpening into ritual, its silence deepening into faith. The soldiers no longer asked questions about the missing convoy or the woman whose orders still echoed through the base's network. They had begun to move as one organism, their timing instinctive, their confidence anchored by something they could not name but felt in every ordered breath. In that silence, her presence remained unseen yet constant, a rhythm threaded through steel and blood alike. Major Reynolds had grown used to the unspoken awareness that hung in the air, that subtle pull toward the southern horizon where nothing visible moved but everything seemed alive. He no longer searched for evidence, he simply listened. At night, when the heat finally broke and the stars returned in merciless clarity, the hum of the earth would change pitch, low at first, then steady, like the sound of engines buried beneath time. It was then he understood that Echo Division was no longer a network, it had become an instinct. One morning, a new order arrived from Central Command. It came in the form of a digital memorandum, curt and colorless, authorizing the full decommissioning of Fort Grayson. Operational redundancy, the report claimed. All relevant data transferred, all physical assets to be dismantled. Reynolds read the words in silence, the hum of the generators underscoring each line like a heartbeat. The logic was bureaucratic, but the decision felt almost sacrilegious. He placed the memo down carefully, his expression unreadable. "They're closing her sanctuary," he whispered to no one. By midday, deconstruction crews arrived, civilian contractors with clean boots and hollow smiles, their machines loud and indifferent. They worked quickly, cutting through fences, unscrewing panels, draining fuel lines as if stripping memory from a body. The soldiers watched in rigid, quiet, resentment simmering beneath discipline. The field that had once trembled under the command of living engines now echoed with the metallic groan of dismantled steel. Reynolds stood among them, his face turned toward the horizon, refusing to look at the hollowing shell of what had been her home. As dusk approached, the power grid began to fail in odd, pulsing intervals. The engineers blamed heat interference, but Reynolds recognized the pattern immediately. The flicker came in measured rhythm, 3 short bursts, one long pause, the same pattern Mara Thorne used for system acknowledgement. He felt a chill despite the heat. "She's watching," he murmured. The lights dimmed again, then stabilized, as though the base itself had exhaled. A low vibration rolled beneath the sand, steady and deliberate, passing through the souls of every man standing there. The contractors' machines stuttered, engines dying mid-turn, control screens going black one by one. The silence that followed was absolute. Reynolds looked to the control tower, where the last active monitor glowed faintly in the fading light. A single message appeared across its screen: "Fort Grayson remains active. Authorization. Thorne." The technicians rushed to override, but the console refused every input. Across the yard, old systems came alive. The siren towers, the long silent radar dish, the mechanical doors of the hangar that no one had touched since the shutdown order. The contractors stumbled back, muttering curses, but the soldiers held their ground, their expressions calm. None of them feared what was happening. They understood it. The base was protecting itself, preserving the integrity of its command. The air changed. A dry wind swept through the compound, carrying dust like smoke, wrapping around the half-dismantled vehicles and broken cranes. The dying light painted everything in gold and crimson, turning the wreckage into a battlefield tableau. Reynolds walked toward the control tower, his boots leaving shallow prints in the sand. The closer he came, the stronger the vibration grew until it wasn't sound anymore but pulse steady, patient, alive. Inside, the monitors burned brighter, displaying lines of code that streamed like verses. Integrity maintained. Guardian presence confirmed. Echo remains. He stopped at the base of the tower, letting the glow wash over him. "You're not done," he said quietly. "You never were." The speakers crackled, releasing a faint burst of static that almost shaped itself into a voice. He couldn't distinguish words, only tone calm, resolute, familiar. He felt his throat tighten as he whispered back, "Understood, Colonel." Then, as quickly as it had awakened, the system began to quiet. The lights dimmed to a soft amber, the vibration easing back into the ground, leaving behind a silence so deep it seemed to echo. One by one, the soldiers lowered their weapons, their faces reflecting something like peace. The contractors stood frozen, their equipment dead and useless. Reynolds turned toward them, his voice steady. "Pack up," he said. "This base isn't decommissioned, it's resting." None of them argued. They left before nightfall, engines stuttering like nervous hearts in the distance. When the darkness finally settled, Fort Grayson glowed faintly under the starlight. The air was still, and every shadow seemed deliberate. Reynolds climbed to the observation deck, the place where she had once stood watching over her command. He looked out over the empty yard, the outlines of structures etched in moonlight, and imagined he could still see the convoy assembled there silent, waiting. The desert wind rose, carrying the faint hum of power beneath the ground. It was quiet enough to mistake for memory, but he knew better. The systems were alive again, just quieter now, moving beneath human hearing, deeper in the earth. He closed his eyes and let the sound fill him. "Once a soldier," he whispered, repeating her creed. The hum deepened, answering in kind. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, perhaps in another forgotten base, perhaps only in the circuits of history, Mara Thorne and her machines kept moving. He imagined her voice still guiding them, measured, calm, eternal. The thought made the world feel steadier, anchored by something incorruptible. When the first light of dawn broke across the desert, it fell upon Fort Grayson like a benediction. The structures that remained gleamed faintly, as though restored by the sun itself. Reynolds stood at attention, saluting the horizon. The hum beneath the ground steadied once more, perfectly aligned with the rhythm of his heart. Fort Grayson no longer belonged to the past. It had become a living monument, a bridge between silence and command, between man and machine, between duty and faith. And somewhere in that measured stillness, the woman in camo, the hidden commander of Echo Division, kept watch over them, all proof that courage, once awakened, never sleeps. The morning that followed the failed decommissioning was strangely beautiful, bright and cloudless, with air so still that sound seemed suspended between the earth and the sky. The desert stretched in every direction, like a great mirror of light, reflecting the ghost of every movement, every whisper that passed through it. Fort Grayson stood silent at its center, restored to a calm that felt deliberate rather than empty. The dismantling crews had vanished overnight, leaving behind half-packed crates, disconnected cranes, and the faint smell of fuel cooling in the sand. The soldiers returned to their routines without command, as if instinct itself had rewritten the schedule. Everything moved according to an order that no one spoke aloud, yet everyone understood. Major Reynolds walked through the hangar bays as shafts of sunlight fell through the metal slats, striping the floor with lines of gold and dust. The air was warm and faintly metallic, humming with the low vibration that had become the heartbeat of the base. He stopped beside the first armored vehicle, resting his hand on the cold steel, and felt that subtle pulse travel up his arm, steady, patient, alive. It was the same rhythm he had felt weeks before when she'd stood there, commanding without words. Now the rhythm had become the base's own breath, repeating through every wall and cable like a vow whispered endlessly in the dark. He paused beside one of the technicians who was recalibrating a dormant console. The young man looked up nervously. "Sir," he said, "we can't shut anything down anymore. Every time we try, the system reboots itself." Reynolds studied the flickering lights of the monitor, reading the gentle flow of code across its surface. The characters were organized in strange patterns, like lines of poetry rather than data. "Leave it," he said finally. "It knows what it's doing." The technician hesitated, then nodded, relief softening his shoulders. They had stopped being afraid of the anomalies. They had learned to trust them. Whatever lived in the base now was not an intruder, but a guardian. By mid-afternoon, the temperature outside had climbed past 100 degrees, and the horizon burned white under the sunday. Yet inside the command tower, the air felt cool, almost serene, as if the walls themselves shielded the place from the violence of the heat. Reynolds climbed the stairs to the top platform where the observation deck opened wide over the desert. From there, the world looked endless, a sea of light and memory that stretched beyond sight. He could almost see her again standing where he stood now, the wind tugging at her torn sleeve, eyes fixed on a horizon only she could read. For the first time, he understood that she hadn't vanished. She had simply merged with the system she created. The desert had become her uniform, the silence her command. That evening, as the sun dropped lower, a soft alarm tone rang through the tower. It wasn't urgent, just a quiet pulse meant to draw attention. On the central monitor, a live satellite feed flickered into focus. A convoy moving east across the desert, 10 vehicles in formation, their shadows long and thin against the dying light. The feed identified no call sign, no registration, only a faint data tag, Echo Prime. The soldiers crowded around the screens, eyes wide, breath held. Reynolds said nothing. The convoy moved with perfect symmetry, the lead vehicle shining briefly as its headlights caught the Sunday. And then, just as suddenly, the image dissolved into static, leaving only the hum of the monitors. A voice crackled faintly through the comms. quiet and composed. Fort Grayson mission acknowledged. Remain at ease. Reynolds lowered his head slightly, his hand tightening on the console. The voice was unmistakable, calm, measured, filled with that same disciplined gentleness that could command silence from chaos. Around him, the room stood frozen, every soldier listening for confirmation. It didn't come, but it didn't need to. The message had carried the same certainty as a salute. After a moment, the lights across the tower brightened by a fraction, bathing the space in pale gold. The hum beneath the floor deepened once, then quieted. The signal was complete. Night returned to the desert like a slow tide, filling every hollow with darkness and cooling the metal until it glowed faintly under the stars. Reynolds stayed at the window long after the others had gone, watching the constellations shift across the black expanse. In that stillness, he realized that Fort Grayson was no longer merely a base or even a memory. It had become a living archive of loyalty. Every grain of sand, every bolt of steel, every hum of power was a record of her command. She had built something beyond mortality, a system sustained not by technology, but by purpose. It would keep running as long as there were men and women who believed in the discipline she embodied. Just before midnight, a faint glow appeared on the southern horizon, a line of light moving parallel to the stars. It was too steady to be lightning, too deliberate to be natural. Reynolds watched it without fear. The convoy was moving again, unseen but undeniable, its engines silent, its purpose eternal. Somewhere within that column of light, the woman in camo still traveled, her orders carried through circuits and wind alike. The thought filled him with a quiet strength he hadn't felt in years. He saluted the horizon and whispered, "Duty held, Colonel. The base is yours." The wind rose gently, carrying his words outward until they vanished into the desert night. The glow on the horizon shimmered once, like an acknowledgement, then faded, leaving only the whisper of engines and the hum of the earth. As the darkness deepened, Fort Grayson seemed to breathe again, its lights pulsing in slow unison with the stars. The soldiers slept soundly, and the machines rested, but neither truly slept. The woman in camo remained their compass, absent, eternal, and perfectly present in every ordered heartbeat that echoed through the desert. By dawn, the first light touched the flag above the base, making it flutter once against the pale sky. Reynolds stood alone in the yard, coffee in hand, the hum of the generators sinking to the rhythm of his pulse. The silence felt less like absence now, and more like protection, a promise written in the air itself. Somewhere out there, beyond the dunes, the engines of Echo Division still turned beneath the rising Sunday. And as he watched the horizon ignite with light, Reynolds finally understood the truth she had left behind. Command was not about control, it was about continuity. The mission did not end with her. It began again each morning, in the quiet conviction of those who remembered. The final dawn rose over Fort Grayson like a slow exhalation, pale light spilling across the desert until the horizon shimmered as if forged from glass. The wind had softened overnight, carrying only the faintest traces of dust, and the base lay utterly still, its towers outlined in gold, its barracks washed clean by silence. Inside that silence lived something steady and watchful, the invisible rhythm that had guided every breath since the day she first appeared. The soldiers woke without trumpet or command, their movements precise and unhurried, as though obedience itself had become instinct. Even the smallest gesture, the folding of a sleeve, the lifting of a gate seemed touched by her memory. Major Reynolds stood in the courtyard, coffee cooling between his hands, his eyes tracing the endless line where sky met sand. The hum beneath the ground was faint now, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the wind, yet he could feel it through the soles of his boots, a pulse that matched his own heartbeat. It had been weeks since any transmission, but he no longer waited for orders. The absence of her voice had become its own kind of guidance, quiet and complete. Command was no longer about giving direction, it was about carrying faith. As the sun climbed higher, a convoy of transport trucks appeared from the north, their silhouettes glinting through the haze. They were the new recruits, fresh faces, clean uniforms, eyes wide with expectation. The sergeant guiding them spoke softly as they passed through the gate, pointing to the flag fluttering above the tower. "That's Fort Grayson," he said. "They say it runs itself." The recruits nodded, skeptical but respectful, sensing that they were entering a place where history had never truly ended. When they stepped onto the yard, Each felt it, the subtle vibration beneath the sand, a soundless rhythm older than the base itself. Reynolds greeted them at the checkpoint, his voice low, his posture steady. "Welcome home," he said simply. He didn't mention the woman in camo, or the convoy that had vanished beyond the dunes, or the word echo that still pulsed quietly through every circuit of the network. Those stories belonged to the base now, and the base would tell them in its own time. Instead, he handed each recruit a small metal pin, a falcon etched in black and gold, and said only, "Discipline is its own voice. Listen to it." That night, when the new soldiers slept and the compound sank again into stillness, Reynolds walked once more to the observation deck. The desert stretched before him, vast and endless, silver beneath the moon. He set the empty coffee mug on the railing and let his hands rest against the cool steel. Somewhere out there, he imagined, she was still moving, the quiet guardian wrapped in camouflage, watching over them in the spaces where technology ended and conviction began. He didn't need proof. The proof was the peace that lingered here, the perfect symmetry of a system that no longer required commands to remain honorable. The wind shifted, stirring the sand across the yard, and for a fleeting moment, the air filled with the low vibration of engines, distant, measured, impossibly real. He closed his eyes and let it pass through him, a sound both farewell and benediction. When he opened them again, the desert was empty, the stars burning cold and steady overhead. He straightened his shoulders, saluted the horizon, and whispered into the quiet, "Mission held, Colonel." The night accepted the words without echo, folding them gently into the hum beneath the ground. The lights across the base dimmed in perfect sequence, every generator settling into its measured rhythm, every machine breathing in calm unison. Fort Grayson slept, but its silence was not stillness, it was vigilance. Beyond the dunes, somewhere between history and myth, the unseen convoy moved again, headlights faint as starlight, engines whispering the creed she had left behind. Once a soldier, always a protector. And as the first light of dawn returned to the desert, it carried that vow across the endless horizon, ensuring that courage, honor, and compassion would never fade, only travel forward, quiet, disciplined, eternal.